All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're executing a rigorous, load-bearing textual critique of Marcus Accius Plautus's Asinaria. This explainer is going to directly interrogate the dramaturgical architecture of the text itself. We're dismantling exactly how Plautus engineers a comedy that systematically inverts the foundational pillars of Roman domestic and societal power. And look, we aren't dealing with generalizations here. We're looking squarely at the primary source material to understand how the comic stage literally became a laboratory for subverting authority.
Our explainer breaks down into 6 tight segments today: introduction and thematic thesis, historical and cultural context, literary composition and style, ethical and philosophical framework, dialectical progression, and finally, transmission and enduring legacy. Let's jump in.
Segment 1, Introduction and Thematic Thesis.
Okay, let's dive into this, because Plautus doesn't just aim for cheap laughter. He constructs a really precise socio-political mechanism, and it all kicks off with this incredible maxim: lupus est homo homini, non homo, quum qualicit non novit. A man is a wolf rather than a man to another man when he hasn't yet found out what he's like. By embedding this provocative Latin maxim right into the text, Plautus establishes an immediate, deeply predatory state of nature. Within the world of the Asinaria, standard social contracts are essentially absent. Interactions are totally stripped of mutual goodwill and replaced by the cynical transactional hunt. It lays the absolute perfect foundation for a plot where characters are defined entirely by their capacity to manipulate and devour one another through deception.
And that brings us directly to our thematic thesis. The Asinaria operates as a meticulously designed dramatic engine, one specifically engineered to subvert Roman societal structures and totally invert domestic power dynamics. Plautus is essentially weaponizing the comedic form to dismantle traditional authority. He takes the supposedly rigid Roman hierarchy and turns it completely upside down within the highly contained, safe space of the stage.
Moving on to segment 2, historical and cultural context. Now, what's really interesting about this is the adaptation process itself. To understand this radical subversion, you have to realize Plautus isn't inventing this from whole cloth. He's actually adapting a lost work of Greek middle comedy called onagos, originally composed by the playwright Demaenetus. So by translating this Greek foundation into a definitively Roman adaptation, Plautus creates this fascinating philological bridge. He imports the core narrative architecture of the Greek original, sure, but then he injects it with a distinctly Roman kinetic energy. He's specifically tailoring the humor and the societal critiques directly for his contemporary Roman audience. So if we track this chronology, it traces a really precise cultural evolution. We begin with the established traditions of Greek middle comedy, which is characterized structurally by a diminished role for the chorus and a noticeable shift away from specific political lampooning, moving toward broader societal archetypes. Plautus takes those elements and translates them into Latin dress, fundamentally re-engineering them for the extremely high-energy, chaotic environment of the Roman ludi, the state-sponsored public games. This festival setting is absolutely crucial because it provided a sanctioned, temporary space for some seriously explosive social inversion. All right, segment 3, literary composition and style. Here, we need to strictly analyze the textual architecture, the specific genre classifications, and the precise dramaturgical devices that make all this social inversion functionally possible on stage. Plautus operates within the genre of the fabula palliata. This is a highly specific Roman dramatic form where Greek comedies are conceptually clothed in the Roman pallium or cloak. And listen, this is a crucial dramaturgical device. By strictly maintaining the fiction of a Greek setting, Plautus is offering the Roman audience a localized, temporary suspension of their own rigid societal norms. It provides this brilliant, protective psychological distance. The Romans can sit there and watch fathers lose all their dignity and slaves totally outsmart their masters because technically it's just happening to the Greeks, right? It allows the audience to delight in the complete subversion of their own gravitas without actually threatening the state itself. To pull this off, Plautus populates this world with highly rigid stock characters, but then he deliberately unravels their traditional roles. Take Demaenetus, he's the senex amons, the lecherous old man who just entirely surrenders his legal potestas, his patriarchal authority. He loses this power to Artemona, the uxor dotata. She's the wealthy wife whose iron grip over her massive dos, or dowry, grants her total financial dominance, effectively reversing Roman patriarchal law. Right at the center of all this is Philinium the Atera, functioning as this economic pivot of affection.
And finally, you have Libanist and Leonida, the servi callidi, the clever slaves. Let me tell you, they do not merely serve. They act as the absolute dramaturgical engines of the entire play, manipulating their supposed masters completely at will.
Which leads us to segment 4, ethical and philosophical framework. Now we're going to rigorously dissect the internal ethics, the specific vices, and the societal values that Plautus is actively critiquing from within the world of the text. Plautus brilliantly exposes the total commodification of affection here, specifically through the totally absurd legalistic stipulations of the Act 4 contract. To secure exclusive access to Felinium for 20 minae, a rival suitor has a parasite draft this hyper-detailed, frankly insane agreement. The contract ludicrously attempts to regulate her every physical movement. I mean, it expressly forbids winking, nodding, or even, heaven forbid, stepping on another man's foot. Plautus is taking the famously rigid structures of Roman contract law and using them to highlight a pretty chilling philosophical point. In this world, love is completely stripped of any actual human sentiment. It's treated strictly as a heavily legislated transfer of property. And this complete ethical bankruptcy is perfectly encapsulated in one fantastic line: facias ipse quod faciamus nobis suedis. Practice yourself what you preach. This line delivers a heavy philological critique targeting the sheer, unabashed hypocrisy of the Senex Demaenetus. It totally exposes the hollow core of the Roman father figure. You know, the guy who lectures everyone on stoic virtue and moral integrity, all while secretly facilitating his own son's debauchery just to satisfy his own lecherous whims. So the crucial point here is that Demaenetus represents the total, spectacular failure of Roman gravitas. Think about it. Gravitas, that immense dignity, seriousness, and moral weight expected of a Roman elder, is just completely obliterated the very moment Demaenetus starts actively competing with his own son over the favors of a courtesan. Plautus uses this specific character to showcase the absolute collapse of the moral dignity that was supposedly the bedrock of the entire Roman Republic.
Let's move to segment 5, dialectical progression. Let's see how this builds, because we now turn to the internal psychological motivations, the character arcs, and the precise structural logic that actually drives the play's central deception right to its climax. The core plot is basically a dialectical execution of a financial scheme to secure those 20 minae. First, an ass dealer arrives to pay the household chamberlain, Satire. Second, the clever slave Leonidas seamlessly assumes the persona of Satire to intercept the funds. Third, and honestly most shockingly, Demaenetus, the actual master of the house, personally provides false authentication to the dealer, completely cementing the lie. Finally, the funds are successfully diverted to the adolescens Argurippus. You literally have the patrician master actively conspiring with his own slaves to defraud his own wife's estate. It's wild. What we're witnessing here is a profound psychological inversion. The servi callidi are effectively elevated to the status of absolute commanders. They dictate the exact terms of the deception, while the supposedly powerful patrician Senex Amans is reduced to a structurally submissive pawn. Demaenetus literally orders his slaves to cheat him. It entirely upends the natural master-slave dynamic and perfectly showcases how financial desperation and sheer lust completely erode rigid social status. All this dialectical progression reaches its structural climax at the infamous illicit banquet. Demaenetus demands a day with the courtesan as the strict price for his help, resulting in a scene of profound, almost incestuous domestic disorder where father and son literally share the object of their affection. But then, the Dawes-empowered wife, Artemona, discovers this little revelry, and she descends upon the banquet like an absolute force of vengeance. She subjects her husband to a brilliantly scathing verbal rating, completely reasserting her authority. She actively punishes his moral and marital failures, and quite literally drags him forcibly back to his state of utter domestic submission. And finally, segment 6, transmission and enduring legacy. And this brilliantly illustrates the text's lasting structural impact on the history of classical literature. Plautus's meticulous preservation of these inverted power dynamics left an indelible mark on comedic textual structures forever. The Asinaria didn't merely entertain, it formalized a powerful dramaturgical blueprint. It created a framework where the marginal, the slave, the heavily dowried wife, the courtesan, could structurally and absolutely dominate the historically powerful. This subversive domestic architecture fundamentally expanded the parameters of Western theatrical narrative.
It proved once and for all that the most effective critique of authority often comes cleverly disguised as farcical comedy.
Which leaves us to consider the overarching structural legacy of the fabula palliata. How do these ancient comedic inversions of societal power continue to echo in modern literary structures? As you independently study primary classical texts yourself, look closely at who truly holds the dramaturgical power, because as Plautus definitively proves in the Asinaria, the ones pulling the strings are rarely the ones actually sitting on the throne.